prominent scholars like today's lecture in the field of communication to benefit the faculty, graduate students, and friends of the department. From his arrival as the chair of the department in 1976, Professor Scheidel organized and supported annual colloquia series in which recognized scholars in the field of speech communication and in fields related to it visited the department and made presentations relevant to the work of its members. And certainly in the choice of today's lecturer, we could not have gotten someone more relevant to some of the work that is being done in this department, especially in science and technology studies. During his 20 years at Washington, Professor Scheidel's contribution to the scholarly work of graduate students and faculty substantially built a reputation of a graduate program where students become productive researchers and contributors to the profession as part of their graduate experience. And one of the things I wanted to do in kind of kicking off the introduction with reminding us of the importance of the Scheidel Lecture is to begin to introduce Chandra as incredibly important to the fields, to multiple fields in which she resides and crosses. I got a quote from one of her former students who I think said very beautifully that she is a model of what a life devoted to public, engaged scholarship and committed teaching could be. When someone dedicates or when someone acknowledges their graduate advisors in this way, it really speaks to the kind of depth of engagement that someone like Chandra has in the work of her graduate students. So it's very exciting for me to be able to introduce her and as part of a lecture series meant to help lift up and engage our graduate students. I got to see this firsthand last year when Chandra was at Stanford and the offices of the Center for Advanced Study, where she was a fellow, are on top of a very, very long and steep hill. I mean, we in Seattle would even sort of gasp at having to bike up this hill or walk up this hill. And nevertheless, you know, on a regular basis, there would be this stream of students, past and present, who would make the pilgrimage up to get some time with Chandra while she was on sabbatical, while she was working on this new project. And each one of them would say, including one of our colleagues at Stanford, a former student of Chandra's, Fred Turner, I never start a new project without consulting Chandra. So, on that note, let me tell you a little bit about the work that she does. Chandra Mukerji is professor in the Department of Communication at the University of California, San Diego. She is author of Territorial Ambitions and the Garden of Versailles. This was published in 1997 by Cambridge University Press. In this book, the construction of the garden at Versailles, she argues, corresponded with the creation of the territorial state of France. She argued this idea that gardens are political, and the Garden of Versailles is an expression of the power of the state. One reviewer called it, and I'm quoting, striking for the sophistication of its argument, its breadth of evidence, and its novelty of associations. It really helps to redefine the way in which material culture is studied within communication, and also the ways in which material culture can be studied for how it communicates power. This book has been incredibly well received. It was the winner of the American Sociological Association's Culture Section Book Award, and this is the largest section in the sociology department. It's sociology division. It's a huge honor to win the culture, a huge and competitive honor to win the Culture Section Book Award. Dr. Mukerji also redefined how we study popular culture in the widely cited and assigned introduction to the volume that she co-edited with Michael Schudson, Rethinking Popular Culture. And I must add, it's one of the reasons why I'm in communication. I read this volume when I was a graduate student, and I said, I want to do work as smart as that. I'm nowhere near that yet. She's also the author of A Fragile Power, Science and the State, which was published by Princeton, and that won the American Sociology Association's Robert Merton Award, which is the highest award given to books in science and technology. Her most recent book, I had it right here.
I remember the name.
And the name is?
Impossible Engineering.
Impossible Engineering. So the wonderful book that came out this year from Princeton University Press, Impossible Engineering, looks at the role of engineering and engineering power in redefining how states communicate their own ability to organize bureaucracy. And it too is predicted to be very well received and honored. With that, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Chandra Mukerji for today's lecture entitled Orientalism. This is why we teach. Orientalism and Visual Communication, Early Scientific Images of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, thank you, Gina. That was very sweet. I'm not that good, but I do love my students, so I do teach. I'm very happy to be giving a lecture in a communication department. And I finally feel as though I belong in a communication department because I've spent the whole of my life studying the way objects communicate, and most people have wondered why and what I was doing. And to some extent, now people do that on a routine basis. And now I'm doing what I, in some sense, should have been doing a long time ago, which is studying a book. Studying an object of communication, but bringing to it, I hope, a kind of understanding of how broadly important objects can be in social life, and seeing what kind of understanding of communication through objects we can gain from that exercise. This is the book that I'm studying. Nicolas de Nicolay was a geographer in 16th century France. It's famous, this book, for its beautiful illustrations. It was a book that was widely reprinted at the time of its publication, pirated like crazy, translated in part into various languages. You'll notice that a lot of the illustrations have Italian titles on them. It was one of the languages that it was translated into. I'm interested in it in part because it's often been called Orientalist. And when I read this book, which was in a sense by accident, I was trying to write on geography publishing outside of Paris and inside of France to know what ordinary people were reading and what the publishing industry looked like in the 16th century when humanism was growing and publishing was growing. But people had not really looked at the small places, provincial places that books were being published. And I was looking for geography books, and I found this book that was all pictures and no maps, written by perhaps the most famous geographer in France in that period. Now, the thing about this book that's interesting in terms of thinking about Orientalism was that it predated colonialism, and part of the definition of Orientalism is in terms of colonialism. It was also published when the Ottoman Empire was far more powerful than France, when the Ottoman Empire was expanding rapidly into Europe, particularly into Eastern Europe, and in that period of time, it had never been stopped, and Europeans were looking at what they thought would be a takeover of Europe by the Ottomans. So the relations of power were very, very different than they were in the 19th century when we talk about Orientalism beginning. And in addition, inside of this book, Nicolay argued against geographical determinism. And although most people don't really think about it, at the heart of the idea of the Orient, of Orientalism, is this idea that the Orient, a place, gives character to people. And Nicolai was arguing precisely against that point of view. So for me, it's a chance to think about Orientalism and to think about the problem of cultural projection from one culture onto another culture, from a place that we think of as very arrogant and controlling, a vision from that place of people in the Eastern Mediterranean based on a position of utter weakness. Utter weakness. The geographers in the 16th century like to think about social types. This is actually early 17th century, but we'll let that pass. The humanist geographers in the 16th and 17th century were interested in sites of social life. So you see in maps like this, pictures of cities, views of cities, or wonders of the world, places made by human beings inside of the world, the geography that had been studied prior to that time. They also took from classical geography the idea that place and climate shaped human character. That the reason why there were different kinds of people in different parts of the world was that there was geographical variation of human types, just like there were geographical differences in the kinds of plants and animals that you would find around the world. They explained social types in terms of two things. One was geographical origins. And they claimed that the climate and the nature of the place that a group came from gave them characteristics that were similar to the place itself. So if you came from a kind of warm and pleasant place, you would be a warm and pleasant person. And if you came from a harsh and difficult climate, you would be a harsh and difficult person. They also believed that people would gain these characteristics of the group that they were born into through descent, so that once the character of your group was determined, you could move, but you would maintain that character. And that was an important part of the argument, because there was also, in this period of sort of Christian Europe, the idea of human exceptionalism. Even though human beings might have been born sort of and sort of have geographical dispersions and geographical character, that human beings had been designed differently by God, so that human beings did not act just like plants and animals. And the argument went that humans lived everywhere, unlike plants and animals that couldn't survive in all corners of the earth. People did. And so there you could see this very distinctive character of persons. So that meant that line of descent was very important for an understanding of human character. Okay, for Nicolai, he had a very different idea. He argued that human beings are sensitive to social environments. They're environmentally sensitive, but what really affects their character is, in a sense, where they grow up. And that social variables can create social types. What kind of social variables? Socialization, the culture that people live in, and the moral order. And there were variants on that, but those were the three major things. And this left then the question of what was natural to human beings. What was their nature, and where did their nature belong in that? So he asked questions about the significance of blood or issues of descent in the formation of races and nations. This is before the idea of race in the 19th century. And he was also very much concerned with the role of moral control over people's predispositions. So let's look at this in relationship to 19th century Orientalism. What does 19th century Orientalism look like? Well, the Orient is a geographical space, and it's a geographical space of inferior people, of people in a sense who were disorderly like the environment. It is a view of race as inalterable hereditary qualities. What you are born with, you are. The belief in measurable hierarchies of the races, differences that you could measure not only in the size of their heads, but also in the character of their way of life. In this hierarchy, Orientals were somewhere in the middle. They were generally sort of disordered, violent, and sexually deviant. Smart, but disordered, violent, and sexually deviant. And they lived in disorderly and dangerous places. These were ideas from classical geography refracted through colonial power relations. Difference in Nicolai. He didn't believe in a racial hierarchy. He didn't really believe in race because it was prior to that time. But he believed that there were distinct nations and an array of them, large numbers of them. He believed that groups had inherent predispositions, which is not to say that they were determined by their descent, because these predispositions could be managed politically and morally. For him, the Orient was not a social determinant. To come from a place did not define who you would be. And for him, Ottoman power, which is what he was interested in, was a social formation of people with predispositions being used for social purposes. In this sense, he was using ideas from classical writings and putting them together with Crusader stories about the Middle East, stories about weakness and stories about defeat vis-a-vis a very powerful and in some ways incomprehensible others. So what were Nicolai's concerns in this? Well, he had ideas from humanism driving his work. He was interested in human nature. He was interested in consciousness. From Christianity, he was very taken with the idea of free will, that people had the ability to make themselves. He had really objected to the idea of geographical determinism because of the idea of free will. He was also driven by the Ottoman Empire's social diversity, which made geographical determinism something hard to believe. If you had a group that expanded rapidly across a large geographical area and at some level sort of remained the same, even as it incorporated all kinds of groups, that seemed to work against geographical explanations of difference. So he was faced with this kind of geographically expansive empire. He also had personal concerns and social motives. He was fearful of Ottoman power. All Europeans were fearful of Ottoman power. He was also afraid of religious and moral differences, and he became more so over time as he traveled through the Ottoman Empire. And most of all, he had a horror of becoming a slave. There were Christian slaves in the Ottoman Empire, and he did not want to be one of them. So he went on a voyage with the French ambassador Ahomont. He was the geographer on his ships to the court of Solomon the Magnificent in order to realize an alliance between France and the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, which were the dominant European empire at that time. And in fact, the empire that was surrounding France. That's the brown part, and there's France with Paris there. So the Habsburg Empire was really surrounding France, and France looked for an alliance with the Ottomans. First, they went from Marseille across to North Africa to meet the Ottoman Navy, then moved across North Africa in ways that I'll talk about in a minute, and then went up around Greece and to Constantinople and the court of Solomon the Magnificent himself. In this travel, he made portraits of social types in the Ottoman Empire and began to develop this kind of social analysis. All right, so why would I even pose the question of Orientalism and Nicolai? Well, one of the reasons is that he gets described that way in the literature all the time. Campbell, who is a historian of anthropology and an anthropologist, describes him as Orientalist. And the major idea is that he projects his cultural assumptions onto others. One argument is that he put the others from the Ottoman Empire into a European-style costume book, although that's not exactly true because he actually, with this book, established the genre of the costume book, although that's not what he was trying to do. And he also included bizarre social types, some of which we'll look at in a minute. So those become this kind of icon of his Orientalism. And he was considered someone who was using visual communication to create an image of discrediting and discredited difference. Okay, so what kind of images? Well, overt sexuality. This is a kind of religious group that believes in chastity and puts these large metal rings through their penises in order to enforce it. So he has this little delicate corner of the jacket pulled up so you can see it. He has images of these types. This is a dervish who he says embrace violence and pain. So here is the dervish cutting his arm. And he's dressed in disorderly clothes, right? So that sort of violence and disorderly quality. He has images of warrior animality. The one that captures his imagination most is the Delhi horseman, and we'll return to the Delhi and what he's like. He's also concerned with deception and false modesty and sees people as not being what they appear to be, people who wear clothes that any fine European would like to be seen in, but have very different customs that are stereotypes, right? Their custom has been to sell their children and have them carried hither and thither among all nations. They also command living and idleness and have many wives. Well, for someone at the edge of the Protestant Catholic thing in Lyon, that was obviously an expression of a kind of terrible prejudice. So here you have images of fearful alterity. An other who is terrible and awful and lying and brutal, but it's not Orientalism. It's something else, and it's the character of that something else that interests me. He was not writing like Debris and Tive, who were writing on the heathens that needed to be reformed by conversion, using the kind of tradition of ethnographic illustration that was popular in geography. Here's a Renaissance body, poses of the sort that you would have in an exercise to learn to be a good Renaissance artist. Or these images of cannibalism with a little kid playing with the head and the water and the bodies being cut up for the barbecue. Neither does he have images of the struggle between good and evil. Here you have these kind of monstrous creatures flying through the air, and the earth is this place of struggle between these kind of weird forces of evil and the forces of good, the kind of image of the garden of nature itself here. He came from a different tradition. A tradition of empirical social typification on maps. So here is a map of his beloved city of Lyon, and what you get in the upper left is a representation of the clergy. Upper right is the prince. Below the prince, you have the kind of bourgeois city father. You have the military, and you have artisans, and then over on the right again, you have the farmer. So it was typical on maps to have these kinds of models of the social structure and represented by social types. And there was something actually comparable in the Ottoman Empire, which I thought was interesting. So I thought I'd show you a picture of a map that also is looking at the ordering of social relations in the Ottoman Empire. But really, the tradition that Nicolai worked out of was geographical espionage. He worked with the French military, making maps of Scotland when the French and the Scots were allies and against the British. He made surveys going with the King of Scotland around the kingdom, providing intelligence for both those kingdoms about Scotland. And then he sold copies to Henry VIII in return for patronage, saying that because they were so important, he just felt that he ought to make a copy, and he'd kept a copy after he had given the other copies to the French and Scottish kings. Military intelligence required accuracy. It wasn't about fantasies of other people. It was about how they worked, what kind of places they lived in, and how to approach them in order to get some kind of political end. And I think that Nikolai brought a similar approach to the Ottoman Empire. So he was a scholar. We know he's well educated by the way he analyzes things. He was a soldier working in the military, and he was a spy, and he was sent off with the French ambassador to meet the Ottoman Navy. So he gets to North Africa, and he writes like a spy. I mean, he writes like a military intelligence officer, I should put it that way. So Algiers is a city in Africa, very ancient, situated on the Mediterranean Sea, upon the hanging of a mountain, environed with strong walls, ramparts, ditches, platforms, and bulwarks. Right? Very important to know what the fortifications are. The city is very merchant-like. For that, she is situated upon the sea, and for this cause, marvelously peopled for her bigness. She is inhabited of the Turks, Moors, and Jews in great number. Without the city, toward the west, are many fair and pleasant gardens, set and adorned with diverse trees, bringing forth fruit of all sorts. But the thing that most shaped his view of the Ottoman Empire was seeing the slave market in Algiers and seeing European slaves there. And in the harbor, the Christian slaves started coming to the boat. Thursday, the 16th of July, a Christian slave that had accompanied Contignac, who was one of the people from the ship, threw himself into the sea to swim to our ship, but a Turk from another ship saw him, also threw himself into the water in pursuit, and got onto his back and would have drowned him without the help of our sailors, who pulled him half dead onto our decks. A number of Turks came to recover the slave. Also his master came, who appeased himself by leaving him with us for 10 écus. Danger made him think about his identity as a European and as a potential slave. Other European slaves started to follow. You can read this. Then Aramal, the ambassador, says, no, we don't have any slaves. He was lying, made Nikolai very, very nervous. He feared for his life and his freedom. So Aramal returned the slaves, sailed to Tripoli, where the Ottoman Navy was assaulting the fort. The 6th of August, we came to Tripoli, a city which Charles V had given in keeping to the Knights of Malta, and was being sieged by Sinan Pasha, who was the head of the Turkish fleet. The Turks, having in the night placed their gabions and their ordnance ready for the battery, did the next day begin to shoot at the castle with great fury, which was not least unanswered, and every hour some slain. Victory. The Turks, having finished the siege, captured an ancient gunner of the castle named Jean de Chabat, born within the town of Romans in Dauphine, which is where Nikolai came from. He was Dauphinois, who had killed a clerk general of the Turkish army. And having cut off his hands and his nose, they put him quickly into the ground, and there with a cruelty he was persecuted and shot at with arrows, and in the end, to accomplish the execution of his glorious martyrdom, they cut his throat. Martyrdom. Turks as unchristian sadists. It was the Crusade nightmare, right? A kind of alterity not based on the idea of arrogant power viewing the other, but a vision of weakness and fear. And the triumph of a kind of inexplicable alterity, some otherness that was too powerful to stop and too complex to understand. The Habsburg loss at Tripoli was seen as a Christian defeat in Europe, was also seen that way by Nikolai. The Christians were losers. The loss was framed in crusader terms. The ambassador was not able to save the French captive. The Ottomans were not really allies, and I could tell you more how that was sort of true in the battle. Nikolai feared for his freedom, and he felt the need to understand Ottomans' reasons to get his social portraits right of the Ottoman Empire. So, a man filled with prejudice, fear, sense of alterity, but driven in a way to have good portraits, precise portraits of the people that he saw. Okay, so he develops a science of alterity. And this is, the way he does it, his method is to have a visual portrait and that kind of written commentary on each type, which pays attention to appearance and dress, so you know what they look like. Geographical origins, so if you're going to describe their character to geography, you know what the origins are. How they're described in classical writing, and what their social characteristics are. Combination of things. Often office or social roles, sometimes ethnicity, race, sometimes character. The precedents for these models were there in his social world. In geography, you had images and you had commentary in writing a book of travels. The maps, the views, and then commentary, which concerned, among other things, familiar names, classical writings, and new observations. But the closest form that he used in creating the style of his book came from botany. He created the equivalent of plant portraits and commentary. And the commentaries in herbals in this period, again, looked at locations, where you found the things, what the familiar names were, what the classical writings said about the plants, and many, many observations on qualities and uses. Okay. So here's an example of how Nikolai talks about a social type. The great leader has for guards 40 lackeys, called in the Turkish language pikes or piklers. Long ago and under Turkish emperors, the pikes that we call lackeys differed greatly in their habits. As others have written, retaining the ancient Greek tradition, they walked and ran on bare feet. So you have the history, right? They came, what they're called, what their names are. Also talks about identifying characteristics, visual characteristics. Each pike is outfitted 2 times a year with a robe of satin or damask. Here you see why it was seen as a costume book. Figured in diverse mixed colors and short. Under this, ample taffeta pulled up over the belt in the style of the ladies of Paris. On their heads, they wear a high hat of fine gilded silver, called in their language scuff, decorated with many gems, of which some are fine and some are false. In one of their hands, they hold a hatchet. And in some cases, they also hold a bottle of perfume, right? So it's the hatchet or the bottle of perfume, whatever that is. Official duties and moral function. These pikes trot in front of the great majesty, Suleiman or Solomon, always run bounding. There's this, sote is bounding, right? It's not just running, it's like something. And always without intermission or repose, which is to say they're great athletes. He admires them enormously. And when they reach a place of verdant fields or beautiful open road, they turn backwards, facing their master, running backward for a mile. It's not really a mile, so I put it in the French. And as long as the beautiful road continues, crying something. It's all praise Allah, right? Which is to say, God maintain his majesty in such strength and prosperity for a long time. He talks about his methods of data collection, which is why we know that he was an educated man. As to me, I report what is factual and want no other than to assure the reader that it is true, because I've seen it with my own eyes. And I have informants, right? And John Antonio Minavino from Genoa, who was raised there in the harem, also wrote about it. So he's been looking at the literature, he's talking to people, and he's looking with his own eyes. Okay. So how does he make social explanations of difference? He talks about cultural traditions and manners, socialization practices, social marginalization, the performative qualities of identity, that it's not deep, it's what people perform, not something inherent, and political exploitation of natural differences, and the management of people with and through pleasure. Using pictures to recognize the social differences, like the botany book or herbal, a field guide to social types to be found in the Ottoman Empire. You could pick it up, look at someone, pick it up, say, I think it's one of those. So it's set out as that kind of form. The pictorial representations are exemplars then. They're meant to be like the birds in Bird Book. They're not supposed to show them exactly the way they look. They're supposed to show their characteristics so you can recognize them. Mike Lynch talks about that difference. There's also a tool of virtual witnessing and a place for visual clues, specific things you could look for to try and identify them. And then he has instructions to the readers on how to read the pictures. And he talks about the problem of deception and represents it in the hands. So when they have hidden hands, that's his way of telling you they're deceptive people. And he also talks about, in a sense, Orientalism, the danger of cultural projection. But for him, the problem is that Europeans looking at people in the Ottoman Empire look at their beautiful clothing because they're wearing the fancy imported silks and brocades that European nobles want to wear, and they don't act like European noblemen. So for him, cultural projection is a central problem, but it's not what we think of as the problem of that. Okay, so here's an example of culture and the creation of a social type. The Persian gentleman comes from the Byzantine Empire, which was the center of classical scholarship in the late Middle Ages. Very Europeanized type and having recognizable manners. So, of course, Nikolai saw him as a very refined and elegant gentleman because he was the carrier of the European classical tradition. The Janissary, in contrast, was a product of socialization and the creation of, explicit creation of difference. The Janissaries were 4-year-old sons of Christian slaves taken from their parents. He argues that leaving their parents so young makes them malicious. They are taught Islam and military arts and are made high-ranking officers of the Ottoman military, and they harbor a deep and abiding hatred for Europeans. In terms of performance of identity, an example is the religious Turk. He treats social identity as what Irving Goffman called a con game. There are, moreover, throughout the whole of Turkey, another set of religious men dwelling within the towns. To show themselves more strange and marvelous, they bring up and feed certain wild beasts, such as wolves, deer, eagles, and ravens, to declare that they have abandoned the world to live a solitary life among the beasts. But in this, their hypocrisy is openly shown, for they do not dwell in hermitages, but in towns full of people, and for the maintenance of their idle life, they go about the streets asking for alms. The Hebrew merchant is socially marginalized, created as well as a type, distinct type. The number of Jews dwelling in all the cities of Turkey and Greece, and principally at Constantinople, is so great that it is marvelous and incredible. The number of these using trade and traffic and merchandise, like money and usury, multiplies daily, and the great hunt and bringing of merchandise from all parts of the sea and land is such that it can be said that they handle the greatest merchandise and money in all of the Levant. And the richest shops and warehouses in Constantinople belong to Jews, and they are most excellent workmen in the arts and crafts. But they're also subject to discrimination. And since their extermination and the vengeance upon Jerusalem until the present day, they have had at no time any certain dwelling place upon the face of the earth, but have always gone straying, dispersed, and driven away from country to country, and yet even in this day, in whatever region they are permitted to dwell, they are abhorred by God and men, and more persecuted by the Turks. In Constantinople and other cities of the empire, they are apparelled with long costumes like other nations of the Levant, but must wear a yellow turban to make themselves known from others. The Delhi horseman is a natural beast-like character, but one put to political use and encouraged in some ways in that way of being. Delhis are adventurers, like horsemen of sorts, whose profession is to seek their adventures in the most dangerous places, where by violent feats of arms they show their strength and manhood. Because of this, they are like to follow the army of the great Turk without any wages. They are of great stature, well shapen, and with big feet, their color being yellowish, but they are naturally malicious and easy to deceive. Notwithstanding this, they were greatly esteemed by Alexander the Great. Turkish women, social control of pleasure. They were made to seem modest with the veil, said Nicolai. But in the baths, they engaged openly in sex and nudity. He describes lesbian sex taking place in the baths. As people often say, what did he know was going on inside of the women's baths? But his writings about the baths and lesbianism has been taken as a touchstone for early lesbian history. So you deal with that too. I don't know. Ottoman people were strictly controlled, but seduced by worldly pleasures from his point of view. They had to live a very controlled life on the surface, but underneath they were given great freedom. So what did this do to the question of natural differences and the idea of what would become race? Are there any natural differences he was really concerned with? Does familial descent really matter? For him, he saw in the Janissary the plasticity of race. Here were Europeans and they were made different. With Jews, you saw the power of descent, but also marginalization that created a kind of coherence of culture in the descent. Delhi horsemen, a natural brutality that was used. How could all these patterns be true? And what he came to the conclusion was that races and nations are lines of moral/natural descent. It's both. Now, it's a complicated argument how he gets to this and what it means to be both. So I'll give you a little bit on Nicolai, on the group that he hates the most, right? Herodotus thought the Thracians to be, next to the Indians, the greatest of all countries on earth, but they've been esteemed among the people of Europe the most cruel, spiteful, and inhumane, proceeding of their nature. For part of them are true Grecians, but the other part is size, a people most barbarous. They also commend living in idleness, and these are the people who commend living in idleness and have many wives. So, why would he be so troubled by these people? Well, in fact, it's because he was troubled about his own identity, just as he was troubled about the Janissaries that way. He questioned his own character as a member of his race. Why? Well, according to humanist geography, there was two lines of descent from the Trojans. One was the Gauls, the other was the Thracians. And what happened was that the Gauls settled in nice, beautiful, peaceful, green, and luxurious France and became charming and not nearly as contentious as Chuck Tilley said. And the Thracians settled above the Baltic in a terrible, harsh landscape and became cruel, barbarous people. But did they? And the Turks were descended from the Thracians and maintained qualities, according to the geographers of the period, qualities of their race. Now, there's no indication that the French created an alliance with the Turks because they thought of themselves as having some deep bond between them, but it is kind of interesting that you get this story. Okay, so if the French and the Turks are basically from the same race, Nicolai wondered whether he was like the Turks or whether he was like a Christian. Whether the descendants of the Thracians to Scythian for moral control. How did race matter if socialization was powerful? Well, of course, he voted for moral differences rather than racial differences. That moral management of character, whether good or evil, was what really created differences in social types. Barbarism and violence were chosen routes for power. They were not inherent. They used predispositions. People had predispositions, but what made a difference was what happened to them. So one could study social difference and enroll those predisposed for war, socialize slaves for violence, tolerate Jews for commerce, but keep them in ghettos and make them wear yellow, and pursue power and not a moral order. And that is what he felt characterized the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman licentiousness and barbarianism were political strategies more than issues of character. Oriental was a political culture of empire, a kind of political authoritarianism that also survived because of moral license. There were rules against drinking, but they were not enforced. There were rules on female sexual modesty, but they were not exercised in the bath. There was lax morality and an inclusionary society, and an appetite for violence that came out of it too. Nikolai then wasn't exoticizing to assert Christian values. He was studying the culture of a powerful other, like a spy. He saw social management and knowledge as the mysterious keys to Ottoman power. And this is a new project. One of the things I want to do is look at whether there was social science he was using for this. So were Nikolai's images Orientalist? Or did his imagery become Orientalist in our hands? Nations as natural kinds were maintained in geography, and people were still seen as products of their environment. And 19th century colonialism racialized the fearful alterity that Nikolai felt and expressed. Social portraits became racial profiles, and Nikolai's images became Orientalist. But Nikolai was trying to trouble geographical and racial determinism in the 16th century. He thought like a spy about Ottoman types, and he showed how social types were used for political effect. He saw fearful alterity as a social product with political value. He rejected Orientalist explanations of how the Orient differed from the West. We see him as an Orientalist because we project our culture onto his pictures and worlds. He projected his fears of alterity onto the Ottomans, but not with the eyes of an Orientalist. Nikolai explained how the Ottomans changed geography, not how the Ottomans were shaped by it. He used prints to demonstrate the social bases of Ottoman power to his readers, and he made his readers virtual witnesses to the life in the empire. Thank you. Questions? Thoughts? Arguments? Counter pictures? Yes?
You said you read this book by accident?
Mm-hmm.
How did you actually happen across it, and what and when did you, what caused you to decide to make this the subject of this analysis?
I ran across it because I was trying to write on this geography in other places, and I was going through inventories. This is the most boring project I've ever done. I was going through inventories of publishers in Lyon and Bordeaux and Toulouse, and they had lists of the number of plates that went with them, and they separately marked maps, and there were no maps in this. And he was a geographer, so I thought it was fascinating and went to see what he was doing. And when I saw him doing a version of Renaissance social theory, I thought, why would anybody be doing social analysis in the Renaissance? What kind of social analysis were they doing? We know about political analysis in the Renaissance. We don't know that much about social analysis in that period, so I was interested in that. And I was also interested in what's happening now in the Middle East. Because I think we have fearful images of alterity. We are living in an age of Crusader imagery revived, and that it's not Orientalist imagery. It's different, and it's really important to understand the difference and to really understand that if it moves from a kind of Orientalist image into a kind of Crusader image that makes a difference for the way in people frame the politics. So I was motivated to write about this, to say, no, there is this other frame. It is projection. It's full of prejudice. It's got a lot of the characteristics that we now think about as Orientalists. But it's not that. And it's not that in some very profound way. And it's not just about religious intolerance. It's a kind of fearfulness that's connected up to that, but it's much more about a kind of inexplicable power that is not possible within the culture to really understand, that's very intelligent. I wrote a piece on 9/11 and talked about the terrorist engineer, right? To have someone who takes the high tech of of America and creates a disaster out of it, both the high rise and the airplane, is very different than having someone just putting a bomb somewhere, right? And so it's this taking over of a kind of power that we thought that was our power. It was very, very frightening and helped to usher in this sense that there is a fearful other. There is an other that can outwit us, that hides and speaks and does all these things beyond our reach and understanding. And that, to me, was what Nikolai was looking at in the 16th century, and I think where our contemporary political discourse is grounded. And so I wanted to pull it out, share it with you, talk about it, try and understand it better, because I think it's a very powerful and deep cultural current, and if you confuse it with Orientalism, you don't understand how scared it is, and fear matters. Yeah.
It's interesting because it seems like part of the way in which he seems to diverge from how we tend to think of how this discourse is, as you nicely illustrate, is this that no, actually for him, race was this kind of malleable, kind of highly contextualized, constructed to a certain degree. I don't know how far you think he went with that, but and yet that becomes the basis for his fear, right? Versus the sort of like
that's right,
the other as wholly other, always that they're universalizing race in the way that we tend to think of how it was done historically,
right?
But no, it's precisely because it can kind of it has a chameleon-like nature, the other does, or that they can deceive us in particular ways. I think that's very interesting, and in some ways, I don't know. I would like to hear you speak to what you think that. Because so often today, the rejoinder to kind of universalizing race is to show the ways in which, no, it's constructed and so on,
right.
Where this case study seems to kind of challenge that as like not necessarily always a way out of race.
Yes, exactly. It's not always the way out, and I think one of the things that's interesting is that he sees other people manipulating it. Right? So because race is so Western, right? Race is ours, and we control it, and we can decide who's what, and we can reject it, and we can say that it's wrong, and in both senses, it's ours, right? But for him, it was not. It belonged to someone else, and the question of that belonging to someone else was really deep to him. Right, and came from his position of weakness. And he's from the bottom of the social hierarchy because he has no place there when he's in the Ottoman Empire. Right? When he's not on the ship with Ottoman, he's nobody. He's just a European in the streets, right? And he talks about being threatened by people. I don't know whether he's threatened or they're threatening, but it doesn't really matter. But that sense of a view from below, looking up into this. And I think that's part of what's interesting, this sense that other people are in control, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why that kind of imagery is so powerful in the US now, because there's this sense that we used to be in control and we're not anymore. That other people can take that control away from us, and we are helpless to do anything about it. I mean, we can make it harder and harder to get through the airport, but we know that that's not changing anything. And so it's not the power of, is it social or is it natural? Because in either case, we define it, right? And we say it's social, and then it's okay, right? But what about if they're saying it's something else? And they are moving our lives, right? Then what is it? And I think that's this kind of fearful alterity that is hard for us to quite grasp, and I think is a very important undercurrent inside of American contemporary politics. That fear, that sense that somehow everybody's out of control, everything is out of control, and that's really powerful part of it. And you're right, that so saying that, you know, race is a social construction doesn't get out of the problem if it's not up to us to decide one way or another. It's not ours. We don't own it. So, yeah.
Well, I wonder how much he was aware that the situation in the Ottoman Empire was far more complicated than he seems to suggest. I mean, for example, many slaves discovered to be brilliant people at a young age, went into the palace school,
right, and
actually rose to the positions of grand viziers.
Right.
And,
yeah.
You know, another example, Sinan, the architect, joining the Janissaries, not at the age of 4, but probably as a teenager, working as a carpenter and rising to become the chief architect of the sultans for a period of 50 years. So, I mean, I know this reinforces the idea that race is not the only thing, but it also suggests that you know, his idea of people being inducted into the Janissaries and therefore becoming cruel and inhuman is a bit...
No, I mean, that's the thing, that there's an enormous amount of prejudice and fear in it. It's, you know, my argument is not that, well, he got it right in some sense, that the Orientalists were bad and he was good. He had a fearful alterity, right? And it was also full of misinformation and full of anxiety and projection and all of those things. What's interesting about it is this sense that this other is massive and magnificent and in many ways, very well organized. It's not disarray. It's not disorder. It's not an inability to do things. It's quite the opposite from that. And that's more and more frightening. And for him, actually, I think, although I don't know that I could actually make this case, that its multicultural character was also very, very disturbing to him, because he lived in Lyon in this period not that far after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So he was in a place, and there were Protestants being expelled from Lyon. The amount of prejudice and movement and purification and hatred and the effort to try and create the opposite of a multicultural society in his world was huge, the world that he came from. So to go to Constantinople and see these things that were astonishing to him, to see the richness, to see the fact that lots of people are wearing these amazing fabrics that only the very wealthy in Europe can wear. I mean, for him, it's astounding. And he comments on all these differences, I think, in part because he's amazed by them. And he's amazed by the ways in which they are sustained and used rather than repressed. And for him, that's fascinating and terrifying. And so in some ways, he's exactly concerned with the fact that these Janissaries are so powerful, right? He's also astonished at high-ranking Moor who made it high up into the bureaucracy. He finds that astonishing. And so it's not that he is ignorant, right? He doesn't understand everything that's going on there. But he does see a lot of detail that's very, very interesting and important in his construction of this vision of this kind of culture and power, the likes of which he hasn't seen, and which most Europeans couldn't begin to understand. And he writes to, with this offer to his readers to instruct them, and says, because they will make mistakes, right? They won't know what they're looking at. they won't be able to understand all the things that are going on. So he's going to introduce these types so they can get a better understanding. So I think that a lot of what you're saying, he doesn't know, but in some sense he understands. And that just frightens him more, right? I mean, he's really terrified. You read the page, he's really terrified, yeah.
I think you